October 4th, 1951. Abadan, Iran. The sun beat down on the largest oil refinery in the world, a sprawling labyrinth of steel and steam that covered the banks of the Shatt al-Arab River like a mechanical city. For decades, this beast had roared day and night, pumping the lifeblood of the British Empire. It was the crown jewel of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, a facility so sophisticated and vast that it generated more profit in a single year than the entire tax revenue of the Iranian state. But on this sweltering morning, the unthinkable happened. The beast went silent. From the deck of the cruiser, HMS Mauritius, the last remaining British technicians and administrators looked back at the shore. They were not fleeing a war zone. They were being evicted by a piece of paper, a decree signed by Mohammad Mossadegh, the frail, weeping yet iron-willed Prime Minister of Iran. Mossadegh had done what no leader in the global South had dared to do. He had looked at the British lion and nationalized its greatest asset. On the streets of Tehran, millions erupted in euphoria. They danced, chanting Mossadegh's name, waving the Iranian flag. To them, the silence of the Abadan refinery was the sound of freedom. They believed that by seizing the physical pipes and the reservoirs of black gold, they had finally reclaimed their destiny. They owned the soil, therefore, they owned the wealth. As the British ships disappeared over the horizon, a terrifying reality began to set in. The British had not just left behind a factory, they had taken the keys with them. They took the chaotic complexity of the supply chain, the proprietary technology to refine the crude, the fleet of tankers to transport it, and the insurance contracts required to dock at any port in the world. Mossadegh found himself standing in the control room of a paralyzed giant. Iran now possessed the hardware, millions of tons of steel and billions of barrels of oil. But they lacked the software of global commerce. The central paradox of this tragedy was now set. In winning the legal battle for sovereignty, Iran had walked directly into an economic death trap. They had seized the asset, but the empire had weaponized the marketplace. The refinery didn't become a source of national wealth. It became a rusting monument to a brutal lesson in modern power, that owning the resource means nothing if you do not control the mechanism of its transaction. The silence at Abadan was not the sound of peace. It was the sound of economic asphyxiation beginning to tighten its grip around the throat of a nation. 4,000 miles away from the silent pipes of Abadan, in the gray, rain-swept corridors of London, the British government was not merely angry. They were terrified. To understand why the British reaction would be so ruthless, one must look past the imperial pomp and see the grim reality of 1951. Great Britain, the victor of World War II, was financially destitute. The war had bled the treasury dry. The empire was living on American loans, and at home, citizens were still using ration books for butter and meat. In this landscape of austerity, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, was not just a corporation. It was the single most important artery of the British economy. It was the lung through which the empire breathed. The numbers were staggering, and they were the fuel for the Iranian rage. In 1950 alone, AIOC generated $170 million in profits. Iran's share, a pitiful $16 million. For London, losing Iran wasn't a matter of prestige. It was an existential threat to the British pound. They literally could not afford to be fair. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the view was equally desperate, but for different reasons. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, often caricatured in the Western press as an eccentric old man who conducted state business in his pajamas, was actually a master tactician trapped in a political vice. He was not operating in a vacuum. He was governing with a knife at his throat. On his left flank prowled the Two-Day Party, communists backed by the Soviet Union, ready to tear the country apart if Mossadegh showed even a hint of weakness toward the West. On his right flank stood the fiery Ayatollah Kashani and the religious conservatives, who viewed the British presence as a spiritual contamination. Mossadegh knew the risks of kicking the British out, but he also knew that if he accepted any compromise, if he accepted a 50-50 profit split like the one American companies had just offered Saudi Arabia, he would be branded a traitor at home. The streets of Tehran were screaming for total sovereignty, not better accounting. Thus, the stage was set for a collision that no diplomacy could avert. The British were fighting for their financial survival. Mossadegh was fighting for his political life. Both sides were backed into a corner where the only way out was to destroy the other. The board was set. Now, the British would stop playing by the rules of diplomacy and start playing by the rules of starvation. London's retaliation was swift, silent, and devastatingly modern. They did not send Marines to storm the beaches of Abadan. That would have been an act of war. Instead, they unleashed a weapon far more sophisticated: a total quarantine of the Iranian economy. The first move was a masterclass in lawfare. The British government placed advertisements in newspapers from Rome to Tokyo, issuing a stark warning to the world. Any drop of oil purchased from Iran was stolen property. The British Navy parked its warships just outside Iranian territorial waters, not to bombard the coast, but to intimidate. They created a phantom blockade. Any independent tanker captain brave enough to approach Abadan looked through his binoculars and saw the silhouette of a British destroyer on the horizon. Most turned back. The few who didn't face the wrath of the global financial system. When an Italian tanker, the Rosemary, dared to load Iranian crude, British jets buzzed the ship and it was impounded in Aden. The message was clear: Iran's oil was radioactive. Simultaneously, the hidden cost of the takeover began to bleed Iran dry. When the British technicians fled, they took the institutional memory of the industry with them. Iran was left with the hardware, the pipes, the crackers, the storage tanks, but without the proprietary supply chain required to maintain them. The Iranians tried to keep the refinery running, but without spare parts from the West, the machinery began to falter. The storage tanks at Abadan, which held millions of barrels, filled up within weeks. With nowhere to export the oil, production had to be shut down. The black gold that was supposed to liberate the nation turned into a toxic liability. But the final nail in the coffin was the devil's contract. Britain, realizing it couldn't enforce the boycott alone, reached out to the American oil giants, the Seven Sisters. In a secret agreement, the major U.S. oil companies agreed to join the boycott, refusing to handle Iranian oil. In exchange, Britain implicitly promised them a slice of the Iranian pie once Mossadegh was removed. Iran had successfully nationalized its resources, but the West had nationalized the market. Mossadegh was now the CEO of a company with 0 customers, sitting on a mountain of wealth he could not sell, while the clock ticked toward bankruptcy. The siege now moved from the high seas to the high street. Having sealed the ports, the British government tightened the noose around Iran's financial throat, activating a trap built deep within the global banking system. The Bank of England froze Iran's sterling accounts in London. In an instant, the country was cut off from its own foreign reserves. Tehran could not import sugar, tea, or textiles, essential goods for a population already living on the edge. The rial went into free fall. Without oil revenue, the government's income evaporated. Mossadegh, now fighting a war on 2 fronts, was forced into a desperate gamble. To pay the army and the civil servants, he ordered the printing presses to run overtime. The result was predictable and catastrophic: hyperinflation. The money in people's pockets lost its value by the hour. This was the genius of the structural trap. The West didn't need to starve the Iranian people directly. They simply created the conditions where the economy would eat itself. The pain radiated into the Grand Bazaar of Tehran, the beating heart of Iranian politics. The Bazaris, the powerful class of merchants and traders, had initially cheered for nationalization. They were patriots, but they were also businessmen. As their warehouses emptied and their savings vanished, their patriotism was suffocated by bankruptcy. The silence of the bazaar was more dangerous to Mossadegh than any British battleship. Sensing the walls closing in, Mossadegh became increasingly authoritarian. Desperate to maintain order, he dissolved the parliament, granted himself emergency powers, and alienated his oldest allies. He broke with the religious establishment and the liberal intelligentsia. The British and Americans watched with cold satisfaction. They had successfully shifted the narrative. The shortages were no longer seen as the fault of foreign imperialism. They were seen as the incompetence of a stubborn prime minister. Mossadegh was no longer the hero who stood up to the British. He was the man who had promised them gold and given them poverty. The structural trap had sprung. The population was hungry, the army was unpaid, and the political coalition was fractured. The ground was now perfectly prepared for the final blow. August 1953. Tehran was a powder keg waiting for a match. That match arrived in the form of a suitcase full of cash carried by a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. Kermit Kim Roosevelt, the CIA's top operative in the region, did not arrive to negotiate. He arrived to orchestrate Operation Ajax. The economic strangulation described in the previous acts had done its work. The Iranian body politic was weak, feverish, and disoriented. Now, Roosevelt simply needed to deliver the fatal shove. The genius of the operation was its theatricality. It wasn't a standard military conquest. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. CIA agents paid street gangs, acrobats, and prostitutes to flood the streets, chanting pro-Mossadegh slogans while smashing shop, windows, and attacking mosques. The goal was to terrify the religious middle class, making them believe that Mossadegh had lost control and that a godless, communist anarchy was imminent. Then, the script flipped. The same paid agitators switched shirts and merged with genuine royalist protesters, now chanting, "Long live the Shah." The confusion was absolute. The police, unpaid and demoralized, stood by and watched the Capitol burn. The climax came on August 19th. The military, which had been hesitating on the sidelines, finally saw which way the wind was blowing. General Fazlollah Zahedi, the West's chosen successor, emerged from hiding. Tank columns, previously loyal to the government, turned their turrets toward the Prime Minister's residence at 109 Cock Street. For hours, a fierce gun battle raged around Mossadegh's home. The old man, who had stared down the British Empire, sat in his room listening to the tank shells tearing apart his walls. He refused to arm his supporters, fearing a civil war that would destroy the nation he loved. By late afternoon, the gate was breached. The noise of the crowd outside shifted from a roar of protest to a roar of conquest. Mossadegh surrendered, not to a foreign army, but to his own countrymen, manipulated by a script written in Washington and London. The collapse was total. The National Front government evaporated in a single afternoon. The Shah, who had fled to Rome in a panic just days earlier, flew back to reclaim his peacock throne. this time not as a monarch by divine right, but as a monarch installed by covert design. The experiment in sovereignty was over. The dust settled on Cox Street, and soon the pumps at Abadan began to hum once more. The tankers returned to the Persian Gulf, and the oil flowed west. To the casual observer, order had been restored. The rebel was under house arrest, and the king was back on his throne. But when the ledger was finally balanced in 1954, it revealed a bitter irony for the British Empire. They had won the battle, but they had lost the war. London had fought to destroy Mossadegh to preserve its monopoly. Yet in doing so, it had been forced to invite the Americans into its exclusive domain. A new consortium was formed to manage Iran's oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now BP, was forced to cede 40% of its stake to the American Seven Sisters. The coup marked the definitive end of British imperial supremacy in the Middle East and the beginning of the American era. Britain had saved its investment, but it had sold its crown. For Iran, the cost was far higher than a percentage of oil revenue. The coup purchased 25 years of stability under the Shah, a period of rapid westernization and glittering wealth for the elite. But this stability was brittle, built on the suppression of the very democratic impulses that Mossadegh had represented. The West had taught Iran a brutal lesson, that peaceful, legal attempts to reclaim national sovereignty would be met with economic suffocation and covert violence. By crushing the secular, democratic option in 1953, the West inadvertently cleared the path for the only force left standing: the religious radicals. The true legacy of the oil embargo was not the fall of a prime minister, but the planting of a delayed explosion. The anger that was silenced in 1953 did not vanish. It fermented in the basements of mosques and the hearts of the students, growing more toxic with every passing year. When that anger finally detonated in the Islamic Revolution of 1979, shouting "Death to America," the West was shocked. They shouldn't have been. They were simply hearing the echo of the coup they had engineered a quarter-century earlier. In the final analysis, the tragedy of Mossadegh offers a timeless axiom of power. Sovereignty is an illusion if you do not control the mechanics of your own survival. Iran possessed the asset, but the West owned the system. Mossadegh tried to play chess on a board where his opponent could simply remove the squares he stood on. It was a noble failure, proving that in the ruthless arithmetic of geopolitics, being right is never enough. You must also be indispensable.